Marcus Reed stood on the bustling sidewalk of downtown Chicago, staring up at the gleaming glass tower of Ellington and Chase Architects. The early morning sun reflected off the building's sleek facade, casting long shadows across the pavement. His heart pounded, a mix of pride and nervous anticipation swelling inside him. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of. He adjusted his navy blue suit, smoothing the crisp fabric as his fingers brushed over the polished leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His mother's voice echoed softly in his mind, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "Marcus, you will always have to work twice as hard to get half as far. But don't let that stop you. Your talent is your power." Her words had been both a warning and a promise. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, Marcus had watched his mother juggle two jobs just to keep the lights on. She had always believed in his potential, even when the world seemed determined to overlook it. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pushed through the heavy glass doors into the lobby. The space was immaculate: polished marble floors, minimalist decor, and an air of quiet sophistication. People in tailored suits moved with purpose, their conversations hushed but intense. He approached the reception desk where a woman barely glanced up from her computer. "Name?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Marcus Reed." "First day," he replied with a polite smile. Her eyes flicked over him briefly before she directed him to the 15th floor. As he stepped into the sleek elevator, Marcus noticed the small details: the art on the walls, the quiet hum of soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. Everything screamed success, yet the subtle coldness in the receptionist's gaze lingered in his mind. On the 15th floor, Marcus was greeted by Tom Willis, the HR manager, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a rehearsed smile. Tom led him through a quick orientation, pointing out office spaces, conference rooms, and break areas. The tour ended at an open-plan office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "This is your desk," Tom said, gesturing to a modern workstation. "And over there is Ethan Caldwell. You'll be working closely with him on several projects." Marcus turned to see Ethan, a tall, sharp-featured man with slicked-back blonde hair and an expensive watch that glinted under the fluorescent lights. Ethan stood from his desk, offering a firm handshake. His smile was polite, but his eyes held something else, something colder. "Welcome to Ellington and Chase, Marcus," Ethan said smoothly. "Hope you're ready to hit the ground running." Marcus nodded, keeping his own smile steady. "I'm looking forward to contributing." As the days turned into weeks, Marcus poured himself into his work. His designs were bold, innovative, blending sustainable architecture with community-focused aesthetics. He stayed late, refining blueprints, double-checking measurements, and ensuring every detail was perfect. His dedication did not go unnoticed. Clients praised his work, and even some of the senior partners nodded in quiet approval during presentations. But beneath the surface, something was off. At first, it was small things. An email he was supposed to receive about a project meeting never arrived. Notes he had meticulously written disappeared from his desk. Once, he discovered that a draft he had saved had been altered, critical details missing, lines skewed as if someone had intentionally tampered with the file. Marcus tried to brush it off, blaming it on office miscommunication or simple mistakes. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Then came the project proposal incident. Marcus had been working on a high-profile redevelopment plan for weeks, preparing to present it to a major client. The night before the presentation, he stayed late to review his final draft, ensuring everything was perfect. But when he arrived the next morning, the file was gone. Not just misplaced, completely erased from the shared server. Panic surged through him as he searched backup folders, emails, even old drafts on his laptop. Nothing. During the presentation, when asked to pull up his design, Marcus had to admit that the file was missing. The client was visibly frustrated, and although Marcus tried to explain, the damage was done. The deal slipped through the firm's fingers. After the meeting, Ethan approached him with a sympathetic look that felt more like mockery. "Tough break," Ethan said, his tone dripping with false concern. "You know, sometimes it's the little things that trip us up. Maybe double-check your files next time." Marcus stared at him, his jaw tight. He saw it in Ethan's eyes, a flicker of satisfaction, the smug confidence of someone who thought they could get away with anything. That was the moment Marcus knew this was not just office politics or bad luck. It was sabotage. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in the nearly empty office, staring out at the Chicago skyline. The weight of frustration and injustice pressed heavily on his chest. He had worked too hard to let someone like Ethan tear it all down. But what could he do? Speak up and risk being labeled as too sensitive or paranoid? Confront Ethan without proof and watch it backfire. As he sat there, lost in thought, someone approached quietly. It was Jordan Ellis, a project manager Marcus had only exchanged brief conversations with in the past. She was sharp, confident, with a presence that seemed to command respect without trying. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low but direct. Marcus hesitated, then replied, "Just thinking about how hard you can work and still have it all slip away." Jordan pulled up a chair. "Or how someone can make it slip away on purpose." Marcus looked at her sharply. "I've been here long enough to know when something's not right," she continued. "And I've seen how people like Ethan operate. They hide behind professionalism while pulling strings to make sure people like us don't get too far ahead." Marcus felt a surge of both relief and anger. Finally, someone saw it. Someone who understood. "I'm not crazy for thinking that, am I?" he asked quietly. Jordan shook her head. "No, you're not. And you're not alone in this." In that moment, Marcus realized that fighting back was not just an option. It was necessary. And he would not have to do it alone. The days following Marcus's conversation with Jordan felt different. The loneliness that had been gnawing at him was now tempered by a fragile thread of hope. He was not imagining things. He was not alone. Jordan became more than just a colleague. She became an ally. They started meeting quietly after hours in empty conference rooms, their voices low as they pieced together the pattern of sabotage that had been eating away at Marcus's career. Jordan shared stories of her own. Times when she had been passed over for projects despite her qualifications. Times when her ideas were dismissed in meetings only to be praised when repeated by someone else. "This place has a problem," Jordan said one evening, scrolling through a folder on her laptop. "But people are too afraid to call it what it is." Marcus leaned forward, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "And what is it?" "Racism," Jordan said plainly. "Not the in-your-face kind. The subtle, quiet kind that hides behind company culture and professionalism. The kind that makes you question yourself until you're the one doubting your own worth." The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Together, they started documenting everything. They kept detailed notes of incidents, missed emails, altered files, projects reassigned without explanation. They saved screenshots, tracked timestamps, and collected statements from other colleagues who had witnessed Ethan's behavior but were too afraid to speak up alone. The more they uncovered, the clearer the picture became. Ethan was not just threatened by Marcus's talent, he was threatened by what Marcus represented. Undeniable black excellence that could not be ignored or dismissed. But Ethan was not working alone. Subtle patterns emerged, small alliances within the office, whispers exchanged in hallways, meetings held without Marcus's knowledge. It was not an organized conspiracy, but a network of silent enablers who benefited from the status quo. People who looked the other way because speaking up was inconvenient. One morning, Marcus arrived at work to find an anonymous note slipped under his office door. "Watch your back. They don't like that you're making noise." No signature, no explanation, just those words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Marcus's hands trembled as he read it. Fear crept in, cold and invasive. What if this was more than just career sabotage? What if speaking up put him at risk beyond the office walls? Jordan found him staring at the note later that day. She read it, her jaw tightening with anger. "This is exactly what they want, to scare you into silence," she said. "But we're not backing down." Marcus nodded, but the fear lingered. The breaking point came during a major presentation for a high-profile client. Marcus had worked tirelessly on the project, pouring in late nights and weekends. But when it was his turn to present, the slides had been tampered with, data missing, graphics distorted, and key details altered to make his work look sloppy and unprofessional. Marcus's heart raced as he stood before the room, trying to salvage the presentation. But he could feel the judgment in the air, the silent question hanging over him. Is he really as good as we thought? After the meeting, Ethan approached with his usual smug grin. Tough crowd. Huh? Maybe next time. Double-check your work. Marcus clenched his fists, his vision blurring with rage. That night, he and Jordan sat in her apartment, surrounded by laptops, documents, and coffee cups. I can't keep doing this, Marcus said, his voice raw. I'm exhausted. Every time I get back up, he finds a new way to knock me down. Jordan reached across the table, her hand firm on his. That's exactly why you have to keep fighting. Because it's not just about you anymore. It's about everyone who comes after you. If you quit, he wins. Marcus closed his eyes, breathing deeply. She was right. This was bigger than him. The next day, they gathered all their evidence, emails, time-stamped edits, witness statements, even security footage showing Ethan at Marcus's workstation after hours. They compiled everything into a formal report and submitted it to HR, copying the senior partners and the firm's legal team. Then they waited. Weeks passed with no official response. The silence was deafening. Rumors spread through the office like wildfire, whispers of an investigation that no one seemed to be taking seriously. Marcus felt the weight of every sidelong glance, every forced smile, every colleague who suddenly kept their distance. But he refused to be invisible. At an all-hands staff meeting, with the entire firm gathered in the conference room, Marcus stood up. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. I've worked here for over a year, and in that time, I've experienced more than just professional challenges. I've faced deliberate sabotage, discrimination, and an environment that protects the people who uphold those behaviors while silencing those who speak out. The room fell into stunned silence. I submitted evidence weeks ago, Marcus continued, and yet here we are, business as usual, like nothing happened. But I refuse to be silent. Not anymore. The room erupted into murmurs, some shocked, some uncomfortable. But amid the noise, Jordan stood up beside him. He's not alone, she said, her voice cutting through the chatter. This isn't just his story. It's mine. It's countless others who never had the chance to speak up. But we're speaking now. The senior partners exchanged tense glances, clearly unprepared for the public confrontation. Mr. Whitmore finally stood, his expression grim. We will address this immediately, he said, his voice tight. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. But Marcus was not satisfied. It's been brought to your attention. The question is, what are you going to do about it? The meeting ended in tense silence, but the message was clear. The days of quiet complicity were over. Marcus and Jordan left the room knowing they had crossed a line, but it was a line that needed to be crossed. They had shattered the illusion of professionalism that often masked systemic injustice. Now, the real fight was about to begin. The days following the public confrontation felt like walking through a storm, tense, unpredictable, and charged with unspoken emotions. The office that once buzzed with quiet productivity now buzzed with whispers. Some colleagues avoided eye contact altogether, while others gave Marcus and Jordan fleeting nods of respect, as if silently acknowledging the courage it had taken to speak out. But the silence from leadership was deafening. Despite Mr. Whitmore's promise to address the matter, there were no immediate changes. No follow-up meetings, no formal investigations. Just the same routines, pretending as if nothing had happened. Marcus found himself wrestling with doubt, questioning whether he had made things worse. Until one afternoon, an unexpected email landed in his inbox. Subject: Meeting request, confidential. It was from Tamara Brooks, a senior legal advisor for the firm's ethics committee. Tamara had a reputation for being sharp, uncompromising, and fearless when it came to matters of integrity. She had been with Ellington and Chase for years, but had largely stayed in the background, overshadowed by louder, more politically maneuvering voices within the firm. Marcus showed the email to Jordan, who raised an eyebrow. Looks like someone's paying attention. The following day, Marcus and Jordan met Tamara in a small, glass-walled conference room tucked away from the main office floor. Tamara was a striking woman in her early 50s, her natural hair pulled back into a neat bun, her glasses resting low on the bridge of her nose as she reviewed a thick folder of documents. She looked up, her gaze sharp but not unkind. Marcus, Jordan, thank you for coming. She gestured for them to sit. Without wasting time on small talk, Tamara dove straight into the matter. I've reviewed the documentation you submitted. The evidence is solid. Emails, timestamps, security footage. It paints a very clear picture of misconduct, not just by Ethan Caldwell but by those who enabled his behavior. Marcus felt a surge of both relief and apprehension. Someone was finally acknowledging the truth. Tamara continued, her voice steady and deliberate. I've also done some digging on my own. What I found is concerning. Ethan's actions are part of a larger pattern: subtle discrimination, favoritism, and systemic bias that's been allowed to fester here unchecked. Jordan leaned forward. So what happens now? Tamara's eyes hardened. Now we hold them accountable. But it won't be easy. The firm's leadership will try to manage this quietly to protect their image. They'll offer polite statements, maybe even a few surface-level changes to pacify the situation. But real change? That only happens when the pressure is too great to ignore. Marcus nodded slowly. So how do we apply that pressure? Tamara closed the folder with a decisive snap. We take this beyond closed doors. Over the next few weeks, Tamara became their fiercest advocate. She helped them navigate the legal and procedural hurdles within the firm, advising them on how to escalate their concerns through formal channels. But more importantly, she used her influence to rally other employees, people who had been silent witnesses to the firm's toxic culture but were now emboldened by Marcus and Jordan's stand. Stories began to surface. A junior designer who had been repeatedly passed over for promotions despite glowing performance reviews. An administrative assistant who had endured microaggressions from supervisors, dismissed as misunderstandings. A former employee who had left quietly after raising similar concerns. Her career stalled because she refused to play along. The floodgates had opened. With Tamara's guidance, Marcus and Jordan organized a formal petition, signed by dozens of employees, demanding an independent investigation into the firm's workplace practices. They requested mandatory anti-bias training, transparent promotion criteria, and the establishment of a diversity and inclusion task force with real decision-making power. The petition forced the senior partners to act. A firm-wide meeting was scheduled, and this time, the stakes were even higher. The large conference room was packed, employees lining the walls, their faces tense with anticipation. At the front stood Mr. Whitmore, flanked by Ms. Harper and other senior executives. Tamara sat among the employees, her presence a quiet reminder that this was no longer just an internal issue. Mr. Whitmore began, his voice carefully measured. We've received your concerns, and we acknowledge that mistakes have been made. But before he could continue, Marcus stood up. His heart pounded, but his voice was clear. With all due respect, Mr. Whitmore, this isn't about mistakes. This is about a culture that's allowed discrimination to thrive under the guise of professionalism. It's about people like Ethan Caldwell being protected while those he hurt were left to fend for themselves. A murmur rippled through the room. Jordan stood next to him. We're not here for empty apologies. We're here for action. We want accountability, transparency, and change, not just for us, but for everyone who's been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. The room erupted into applause, loud, unapologetic, and powerful. For the first time, Marcus saw fear flicker in the eyes of the leadership, not fear of losing control, but fear of facing the truth. In the weeks that followed, Ellington and Chase underwent a transformation. An independent investigation confirmed the patterns of bias and misconduct. Ethan's termination became permanent, and several managers who had enabled his behavior were either disciplined or dismissed. But the real victory came when the firm implemented structural changes. A new diversity and inclusion council with real authority, co-led by Tamara. A transparent promotion pathways to ensure merit, not favoritism, determined career growth. A mandatory bias training for all employees, including senior leadership. A mentorship program to support young professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. Marcus was offered a leadership position, senior project architect, with direct influence over the firm's diversity initiatives. He accepted, not for the title, but for the opportunity to be the change he had once needed. One evening, as Marcus and Jordan sat in his office, reflecting on everything that had happened, she turned to him with a smile. Crazy how one voice can start a movement, she said. Marcus shook his head, smiling back. It wasn't just one voice. It was all of us. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The ripple effect of Marcus and Jordan's bold stand continued to spread throughout Ellington and Chase Architects. The firm was no longer a quiet place where uncomfortable truths were tucked neatly behind polished glass walls. Conversations that had once been whispered in hushed tones now echoed openly in meetings, hallways, and emails. There was no going back to the way things were. But the real confrontation was yet to come. The independent investigation led to the inevitable, a formal disciplinary hearing involving Ethan Caldwell. Though he had been suspended, the firm's leadership needed to address his actions officially to satisfy legal requirements and public scrutiny. Marcus was called to testify, along with Jordan, Tamara, and other employees who had come forward with their experiences. The hearing took place in a large, sterile conference room, the kind designed to feel neutral but heavy with tension. At the center sat a long table, with members of the firm's ethics committee on one side and Ethan on the other, flanked by his attorney. Marcus felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest as he walked in, but he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had nothing to hide. Ethan looked different, less confident, his arrogance chipped away by the reality of being held accountable. His once smug expression was replaced by a tight, forced smile, as if clinging to the last shred of control. Marcus took his seat, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. The questioning began, formal and structured. Marcus recounted the timeline of events, the missing files, the tampered presentations, the subtle but deliberate efforts to undermine his work. His voice was steady, but every word felt like reliving the exhaustion and frustration he had carried for months. Ethan's attorney tried to twist the narrative, suggesting that Marcus had misunderstood or overreacted, framing the incidents as miscommunications or technical errors. But Marcus did not waver. This wasn't about one missing file or a calendar error, Marcus said firmly, looking directly at Ethan. It was a pattern, deliberate, calculated, and rooted in the belief that someone like me didn't deserve to succeed here. You didn't just target my work. You targeted my worth. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling under the weight of the truth. Jordan testified next, her words sharp and undeniable. I've seen how this firm operates, how people like Ethan thrive not because they're the best, but because the system protects them. Marcus isn't just here because he's talented. He's here despite every barrier thrown in his way. Tamara's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. As a legal expert, she dismantled every weak defense, pointing to documented evidence that showed Ethan's clear pattern of misconduct. When the hearing ended, the room emptied slowly, leaving Ethan sitting alone, staring at the table. Marcus walked past him, pausing briefly. You thought I'd stay silent, Marcus said quietly. But silence is where people like you hide. Not anymore. Ethan did not respond. He had nothing left to say. A week later, the firm issued its decision. Ethan Caldwell's employment was terminated with cause. The official report cited gross misconduct, unethical behavior, and violations of the firm's code of conduct. But the true verdict had been delivered long before that day, in every voice that had spoken out, in every truth that had refused to be buried. The firm's leadership faced its own reckoning. Several senior managers who had enabled or ignored discriminatory practices were quietly let go. Policies were rewritten, not just as legal protections, but as genuine commitments to equity and accountability. Marcus, now promoted to senior project architect, found himself navigating a new landscape. His office overlooked the same Chicago skyline, but his view of the world had changed. One afternoon, Mr. Whitmore stopped by his office. His usual stern demeanor was softer, touched with something almost like humility. I wanted to say thank you, Whitmore said awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. You didn't just challenge Ethan. You challenged all of us. And whether we admit it or not, we needed it. Marcus nodded. Change isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. Whitmore gave a small smile. You've made this place better. Keep pushing us. And Marcus did. Outside the walls of Ellington and Chase, Marcus's life flourished. He reconnected with his roots, speaking at community events, mentoring young Black architects, and sharing his story not as a tale of corporate politics, but as a testament to resilience and courage. One evening, after a long day at work, Marcus visited his mother's old neighborhood. The same streets where he had once dreamed of skyscrapers now held new meaning. He stood in front of a community center where he had volunteered as a teenager, watching kids laugh and play, their futures unwritten but full of potential. A young boy approached him, wide-eyed and curious. "Are you really an architect?" the boy asked. Marcus smiled, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "I am. Can I be one too?" Marcus's heart swelled. "You can be anything you want. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Back at the firm, Marcus's influence grew, not just through his projects, but through the culture he helped reshape. He and Jordan co-led diversity initiatives, created mentorship programs, and ensured that every voice, no matter how small, was heard. During an annual company meeting, Marcus stood on stage, addressing the entire firm. "When I first walked through these doors, I thought my work would speak for itself. But talent isn't always enough when bias stands in the way. I learned that silence allows injustice to grow, but courage uproots it." The room was silent, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Marcus looked around, his gaze settling on faces old and new. "We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. And that future starts with accountability, with honesty, and with the courage to stand up, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard." The applause that followed was not just for Marcus, but for the movement he had sparked, a movement rooted in truth, resilience, and the unyielding belief that change is possible when people refuse to be silent. As Marcus left the stage, he felt a profound sense of peace, not because the work was done, but because it had finally begun. A year had passed since Marcus Reed had stood up in that crowded conference room, his voice steady against the silent walls of Ellington and Chase Architects. But the echoes of that moment never faded. They grew, spreading through the halls, through boardrooms, and into the hearts of those who once thought silence was the safest choice. Marcus sat in his corner office, the skyline of Chicago stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city was a mosaic of glass, steel, and stories, much like his own. On his desk sat a framed photo of his mother, her smile a reminder of the lessons she had instilled in him. "You'll have to work twice as hard to get half as far, baby. But don't let that stop you." He had carried those words like armor, but now he understood something deeper. It was never just about working harder. It was about refusing to shrink in the face of injustice, about standing tall even when your voice shakes. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Jordan stepped in, her easy confidence as present as ever. "Big day," she said, dropping into the chair across from him. Marcus smiled. "Feels like every day's been a big day since we decided to stop playing it safe." She chuckled, nodding. "Yeah, but this one's different." They were about to announce the launch of the firm's new mentorship program, one designed specifically to support underrepresented talent in architecture. It was not just a corporate initiative, it was a promise. A promise that no one would have to fight the battles Marcus had faced alone. As they walked to the conference hall, Marcus reflected on how far things had come. The firm was different now. Not perfect, but honest about its flaws and committed to growth. People spoke up without fear, ideas flowed freely, and the leadership was no longer a closed circle of privilege. When Marcus took the stage, the room grew quiet, not with tension, but with anticipation. He looked out at the faces before him, colleagues, new interns, community leaders, and felt a deep sense of purpose. "I stand here today not because I never faced failure or fear," Marcus began, his voice steady. "I stand here because I refuse to let injustice define my worth. I stand here because silence was never an option." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We've built more than buildings here. We've built a culture where everyone has a seat at the table, where voices aren't just heard, they're valued. This mentorship program is more than a pipeline for talent. It's a bridge between potential and opportunity." Applause filled the room, not the polite claps of obligation, but the genuine kind that comes from hearts moved by truth. After the event, as the crowd dispersed, a young black intern approached Marcus. Her name was Ava, and her eyes sparkled with a mixture of excitement and determination. "Mr. Reed," she said nervously, "your story. It's why I applied here. I thought if someone like you could make it, Maybe I could too. Marcus smiled warmly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't have to be like me, Ava. You just have to be you. And that's more than enough. As she walked away, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. Not the fragile kind that comes from avoiding conflict, but the enduring kind that comes from facing it head-on and choosing integrity over comfort. Back in his office, Marcus looked out at the city once more. The skyline had not changed, but he had. He had come here to build structures. But what he had truly built was something far greater: justice, courage, and the blueprint for change. And that blueprint would stand long after the glass and steel had faded. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to stand up against injustice, even when it feels like the world is against you. Change does not begin with titles or positions. It begins with voices willing to speak, hearts willing to fight, and people refusing to be silent. Marcus's story is a reminder that standing up for what is right can inspire others to do the same, creating ripples of change that reach far beyond the walls where the fight began.